Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the last day of Spring1, or Platform Spring1, rather. It's nice to see that there are so many people still awake and not totally crushed from the previous 2 days. So thanks for showing up. And welcome to 40 Tips and Tricks for Spring and IntelliJ IDEA. The title is a blatant lie because we show much more than 40, but I guess you'll be fine with that.
Yeah, much less, you won't be able to count.
Yeah. So my name is Yann Cebron. I'm with the IntelliJ IDEA team in JetBrains. I work on the Spring support, and I'm very honored to have Stephane Nicoll from Pivotal with me.
Hello, I'm Stephane. I'm working on Spring Framework and Spring Boot. And the reason I'm here is I'm actually working with Yann on a daily basis on tooling support. So we chat every now and then, and we make sure that the tooling support in IntelliJ IDEA for Spring is excellent.
Yes. So what is this talk about? Just to give you a clear idea what we are going to do in the next hour. This is the only slide you're going to see. After that, I'm going to switch to IntelliJ, and we'll be doing a 1-hour live coding session. We'll try to cover as many sub-projects and aspects of Spring support in IntelliJ as possible in 1 hour. And the key takeaway is today for you. If you're new to IntelliJ, you're going to see what is actually possible with the Spring support. If you already have some experience, you hopefully pick up some new tips and tricks today, learn about new stuff we put in the last version, 2016.2, which was released a couple of days ago. So I guess we are ready to start. But before that, I have 2 questions. Who is using IntelliJ IDEA already?
Whoa, 80%.
Okay, so we have a lot of people with at least some kind of experience. Who is using Eclipse SDS or NetBeans? Okay, just a few here. We are not going to cover like the IDE basics today, so if you don't grab something, please drop by later and ask me why I do stuff like this in IntelliJ. We just concentrate on the Spring support today. Okay, let's get started. So, we have prepared a demonstration project, which is also available on GitHub. I'm going to post the link later on Twitter if you want to replay it at home to understand what we did today. It also includes the script, so you're really able to follow step by step what we do today. So I just opened this demo project, and the first thing you notice in the lower right corner is this notification. It's saying something that there are some unconfigured Spring configuration files found in this project. So the basic idea in IntelliJ is if you want support for a framework or library, you need to add a so-called facet. A facet is basically meta information for that framework, which is added to the corresponding module. And there you can then enter specific settings for that technology, framework, whatever. And it's very important for an IntelliJ IDEA to actually know what your Spring setup looks like. And in some cases, you have to tell it what the context looks like. So maybe Stephane can tell us a bit more.
Right. So really what's happening is you have a bunch of configuration files, right? So you define beans, you define configuration. And, oh, I dropped again. Okay. So what's really important is you need to make sure that the Spring facet is configured in IntelliJ IDEA, because it may not be such obvious now. They've improved that a lot with this notification. But you may be in a situation where you think the Spring support is enabled, and it's really not really enabled, because as long as you don't create this facet with the context, IntelliJ IDEA cannot parse your configuration and give you smart auto-completion. So one way to know about that stuff is when you are in a component class. So you open any bean that you have an add component on it. If you don't have a gutter icon on the left, it means that IntelliJ IDEA does not know it's a Spring bean. And if it does not know it's a Spring bean, then it can't give you auto-completion down the road. So the most important part, I think, in the presentation is make sure that the Spring facet is configured for your module properly, and we're going to show you how to do this.
Right. So there are a couple of links in this notification. Yeah, I'm going to switch to the presentation mode in a minute. There's one link which is called Create Default Context. What that does is you can organize your Spring contexts or you can organize your Spring configuration files in various contexts so they are really separate, and thereby you can model like hierarchies in your context, use a parent relationship between two contexts, which is, by the way, the default setup for Spring MVC. You have a servlet context and an application context, and they have dependencies between each other. So what does this create default context fix do for us? It will create that Spring facet, and it will also put all the found configuration files into one global file set, which is in most cases what most applications can work with. Then you can still tweak it or set it up manually later. There is, though, a very important thing with Spring Boot and Spring MVC. You don't need and you shouldn't try to configure those applications manually in the Spring facet, because those applications have very strict rules on how they are set up. So we run an auto detection on them, and we'll create the necessary file sets for you automatically. And you cannot edit them, and you shouldn't try to do it manually.
So the bottom line is, if you're using Spring Boot or Spring MVC, they'll take care of you.
Yeah. So I get this notification now on the top that it already found some auto-detected context for Spring MVC, because that's part of the demonstration. And it notifies me that I can now perform the setup for any additional configuration files, because it doesn't know if I need or how many contexts I need and what files should be in what context. So that's something the user has to do later. I'm just going to close that notification for now, and we are now going into code mode. So what we have here is a very simple configuration class, and it has some yellow highlighting. And the warning is that the application context is not configured because, as I said, we need to set up those file sets. We already have a Spring facet, which was created by the quick fix I just invoked, and I can now press Alt-Enter to invoke the quick fix menu from IntelliJ IDEA. This is really one of the most important shortcuts in IntelliJ. By the way, all the shortcuts are shown on the bottom of the screen. They may differ on your system or depending on the key map it shows, but it's one of the key things to do if you want to master an IDE, learn the shortcuts, because otherwise you are wasting your time. So let's invoke this quick fix. I can create now a new context, and this will open the configuration dialog. I can give it a descriptive name. And then the configuration class, which I used to invoke this fix, is already pre-selected. I'm just going for that single config class. Click OK. And if you just noticed on the left side of the editor, that's the so-called gutter area where we show icons, which are mostly for information or navigation purposes. And we just received a bunch of them. So that means now the warning has also gone away. So the IntelliJ IDE now understands that this configuration is part of your Spring setup in your project.
So in the demonstration, we will create several contexts with only a subset of your configuration in the project. The reason why we will do that is to just separate them as separate examples so that they don't pollute each other. But in practice, in your own project, usually what you have is one facet with one context and you configure it, right? So don't get confused if we start creating a bunch of contexts. This is not something you will do in a regular project.
All right, let's take a look at those icons. So the first one I want to talk about is this here, and the tooltip says something about Spring model dependencies. So this configuration class does have a couple of additional Spring config related annotations. We have a component scan, we have an import for additional configuration classes, and we also import some XML resource just to go back a bit to the 90s. And sometimes it's a bit hard to understand what the actual context at runtime will look like. When you have imports, when you have component scans, you could possibly create a huge set of configuration classes which are dependent on that main configuration class. And we can inspect this right in the IDE by just clicking on this Show Model Dependencies diagram. And we can see that there are a couple of nodes here which represent on this level the file set, the context we have, then the configuration class which is defined. It also shows a bit more information in the tooltip, like the number of imports and stuff like that. And then we can see all those imports which we just discussed. An import can have other imports, so you can actually see the whole graph of your configuration as it will be built by Spring at runtime. And this is a very nice feature, I think, to understand setup problems in your project if you are new to a project and if you need to understand what the structure of the Spring configuration actually does at runtime. Of course, we can navigate from here to the corresponding nodes, so that's what I'm going to do. In this XML file, which is included on a second level. This graph is also very nice to detect cycles. So for demonstration purposes, I duplicated this component scan definition, which will result in all the beans or configuration classes which are scanned being duplicated. Is that something that happens quite often, or?
Yeah, well, it depends on your project, really. Typically, if you use a Spring Boot application with the directory structure that we recommend, you have less chances to end up in that situation. But if you have a project, a Spring Framework-based project, with lots of XML configuration, it's not really easy to figure out what's coming and when. So typically for cycles, the context actually is quite powerful to detect them and to still be able to load your application, which I think can be a problem, right? Because we've built that feature, the community asked us to be smarter about it. But on the other hand, the fact that you don't have an exception right away means also that sometimes your configuration is actually invalid and you don't really know it's invalid. One thing which can be a problem in this situation is if you scan a bean definition that doesn't have an ID, so if you think about the XML configuration, bean class, some class, right? You don't specify an ID because you don't need that. If you import that class twice, you'll get two bean definitions for that thing. Because the first time it's going to be processed, the bean definition will be read, an automated generated ID will be associated to it, and the second time we'll process it, well, we'll parse it again and generate another automated generated ID for that. So you'll end up with two beans in the context, and you probably don't want that, right? So I've seen a lot of people actually fixing that by adding an ID, because in this case, since you provide the ID and the ID are the same, the bean definition will be overridden, and you'll end up with one bean. But really what you should do is use those kinds of features to detect those cycles and cut those cycles.
So maybe it's a bit hard to see on the screen, but there is a red arrow here, duplicating basically the blue arrow, which defines the original and not duplicated component scan. And again, I can even click on those arrows and it will bring me to the exact definition where this node is referenced from. So that's a real nice feature to spot setup problems and visualize setups of your Spring app.
If you're using Java config, you've noticed that in the component scan annotation, there is a getter icon next to it. That's actually one of my most favorite features. If you click on that, you'll basically get the list of beans that have been imported, that have been found via that directive. So you may have several component scans for whatever reason. Probably don't do that, but you might, with different package space. And if you click on each individual ones, you'll exactly see the beans that will be registered at runtime. It's very useful.
Right. So we see the list of bean names and classes or types of those beans. And we can, of course, click on them to navigate to the beans which are actually included by the component scan definition. But one of my favorite tricks to save time in any or most of all these pop-up or completion lists in IntelliJ is to use a feature which is called quick definition. When I do that, it will actually open this pop-up here and show me an inline editor representation of that navigation target. So I don't have to click on it to see what is actually behind this name, but I can just see it in the list. I can open the other one as well, and I don't have to leave my current editor just to inspect stuff.
So in Spring Framework, there is this, this feature that's quite popular these days, which is meta-annotations. We've used that extensively in the framework these days. So meta-annotation is about composing several annotations for a given use case. So in Spring Framework 4.3, we have this get mapping annotation. You all probably know if you use Spring MVC request mapping, where you basically give the path and some attributes such as the HTTP method to bind to. So if you need to have a request mapping on the same URI for post and get, you'll have two methods, one that says, okay, I want for the get and I want for the post. So we thought that maybe it would be nice to have some kind of dedicated annotation for that and yet still support all the features. So in 4.3, we have get mapping and post mapping, which is basically a meta annotation on request mapping with the dedicated method, so you don't have to specify it. You can do that for plenty of things. So for instance, if you have a service that needs to enable cache and transactional, you could create an annotation, my transactional cache, or whatever the name it is, my service, that will apply those two aspects. What's important effectively is when you do that, or when you use such feature, you don't lose IDE inspection. So Yann is going to show you now what happens if you create your own component scan annotation. Again, it's not something you would do, it's demo purposes, but keep in mind that that's the kind of feature you would expect if you meta-annotate other features.
Right, so let's take a very quick look into our demonstration annotation. As you can see, we have the add component scan here, so it's recognized as a meta annotation of the Spring Framework core annotation. And there's a dedicated annotation to also redefine existing attributes, so you can redeclare them, give them a new name. And this allows for annotation, also receives code completion support in IntelliJ. So what I have here, I have a string array which should redefine the original base packages attribute, and IntelliJ IDEA will automatically show me all matching attributes which are available in the original component scan annotation and propose those names for me, because I also defined from what annotation I want to alias existing attributes from. And going back to the main configuration, you can see that all the navigation icons and stuff are still available. And that works basically for all your own custom meta annotations. So anytime you do something like this, you will not lose the IDE support, which is built for the original Spring Framework annotation, but it will be smart enough to figure out that you actually are using the original attribute and provide the same level of support for that as well.
So if you feel that there's too many gutter icons on the left, and you start to be a bit sick of it, because maybe some of them are not really useful, keep in mind that you can actually disable them if you don't want to see, for instance, the diagram thing, because you're not using it very often. It's very easy to disable that in the options.
Yeah. So we tried to split up all the gutter icons into separate settings, so you can really tune it according to your personal preference. Okay, so much first for now on the code configuration stuff. We are going to come back to this class in a minute, but first we're going to switch to something about the UI. So there is a dedicated Spring tool window in IntelliJ IDEA. What can I do here? I can see the list of beans in my project, which is very handy because you can actually make sure that your setup is correct by just checking for the resulting beans, which hopefully matches what you would want at runtime. And you can also use it to show more information about it. So when I click here, I double-clicked accidentally, so it already opened the definition of that bean, but you also have documentation support here. We can see that some of those beans are highlighted with a different background color. That is because they are implicit beans, which are provided by the Spring framework automatically. We can switch them on and off if we don't want to see them. And you can also see some infrastructure beans, like the component scan stuff. Another thing which is very nice, when I close this tool window for now, and I go back to one of my beans in my application. Sometimes it's a bit hard to understand where it is actually defined. So one thing I need to enable first to make it more useful is to show the contexts as well. And you can see we have the hierarchy between the context, the configuration files, and then the resulting beans. Okay, closing that again. And when your cursor is on some definition, there's a generic feature in IntelliJ to navigate or select that element in one of the tool windows. And that's called Select In. There's a couple of navigation targets, the project view, for example, but also the Spring Beans view. So when I select that one, it will actually expand the tree automatically to match the corresponding configuration and the contexts which are responsible for setting up that bean. So that's a nice way to inspect where does this bean come from? Where did I set it up? Okay? Okay, so much about the Spring tool window.
Let's see some code.
Yes. Let's actually type a bit now. So back to our main configuration class. First thing we are going to do is we are a bit unsure what maybe the screen top bar here is. It doesn't really show any text, but the tooltip says something about active profiles. So what are profiles in Spring?
Right. So profile is a Spring feature that allows you to tune the context, for instance, to override some beans or to add additional beans, or in the case of Spring Boot, add additional configuration, right? So the most basic example you could find if you're using Spring Framework directly, you probably create a data source yourself, which you wouldn't do if you were using Spring Boot. And in the local environment, you want to have an in-memory database. And when you deploy your app in production, you want to use, I don't know, some persistent database, whatever you choose to use. So there's really two bean definitions, or maybe some properties that are changing. And you want to be able to do that without changing the content of the jar. So you want to have the same application and just flip a switch and enable one or the other. Spring Framework has this profile annotation you can use on configuration classes to say, enable that configuration class when that profile is active, right? So you could say, you could put the production database in some kind of production database config or whatever, add profile production on top. And every beans that are defined there will be loaded and will eventually override the ones which have no profile. And there is a way to enable a profile via a property. But right here, what we have is, maybe we can activate a profile or something. Mm-hmm. That's what you want to do?
So, yeah. Mm-hmm. So we can actually simulate that switching that Stephane just explained, for example, between dev and production environment, by telling the IDE which profile should be active right now in my IDE so that I can navigate the Spring context as if it were on the said environment, for example.
So that's really the second step, right? The first step is to configure the context. If you're using Spring Boot, Spring MVC, that's done automatically for you. So that IntelliJ IDE knows about the config, right? It knows about what you've defined. The second step is to say, in my environment right now, I'm running with the production profile. So what that means is whenever you ask for the data source bean, it's going to point to the bean definition that actually defines the production data source. Because it will know, because you said, I'm running with the production profile. So it doesn't do anything special at runtime. but it gives you inspection like the profile was active.
So here we can change the active profile actually on different levels, on project level, on module level, or even on the specific context. We have two profiles here, main and custom. I'm going to activate the main profile now. We can see the name of the active profile is now shown in the editor top bar. So you are always aware what profile did I just activate in my IDE, what am I seeing right now. Are those errors actually what I want to see right now?
But there is a red thing on the long bean.
Yes, I'm sorry.
That's on purpose, I'm sure.
So there's a long bean. Please excuse the type, it's just for demonstration purposes. But there are apparently two beans defined which would match by the type long. And so Spring doesn't know what to do, right?
Right. So if you start this app, it will fail. And IntelliJ IDE knows right now already that it will fail. Because of the profile you've enabled, there is probably an extra bean definition for that bean type that has been added or something. And you're basically asking the context, give me a bean of that type, but there's two of them, and you're not specifying which one Spring should actually inject. So what's nice is that IntelliJ IDE knows about that stuff, and it will be able to warn you and to give you assistance. So maybe we could try a quick fix and see what happens.
Maybe there's a quick fix. Hooray, there is one. So
it's the same shortcut again. Yeah. Remember main configuration, we did quick fix, add to the facet. It's always the same shortcut. So whenever you see a warning, be it in the Spring support or not, always use that quick fix, because probably the first option will be something to help you fix that.
So the quick fix it shows me here are two actually, the first upper ones. The first one is to add a qualifier, which we are going to do in a second. And the second one is also interesting because I can actually now show again the list of beans which are possible auto-wiring candidates in that place. And again, I can use my favorite shortcut, quick definition, to inspect them, to see which one do I actually want. So when I now invoke the fix to add the qualifier annotation, of course, again, you get auto-completion here, and I can just pick one. I can control-click here. I even have quick dock here, right, in the editor. I can go there, and we can see, yes, this is correct, because this configuration is active for main profile only. And IntelliJ IDE understands all of this in your IDE, right? So that's a huge time saver if you use profiles or auto-wiring or any of those features, that you get validation immediately as you set up your application while writing the code. So I think there's still maybe a problem here.
That IDE always complaining, really. What
So
again? Oh,
the auto-wired annotation doesn't like it. Field injection is not recommended. Why is that?
so you probably heard of that before. The Spring team recommends you not to use field injection. For one, it does not enforce immutability of your service. So if you inject dependencies, there's no reason to change them. So you probably want to make the fields final, and you can't do that. Second is, if you use that technique, you can't use the field in the constructor, because we first need to create an instance, and once we have the instance, we can set the value on the field. That's what auto-wired on the field does. So if you start to use that field, which usually you should without Spring Framework, then you'll get an unpointer exception because the field is not set yet. And lastly, if you promote constructor injection, it's much more easier to test your code without Spring, which is something you should do whenever possible.
Yeah, and there was one blog post which was quite popular with this, and it was written by Oliver Gilke from Spring Data team, and he made a nice rant not to use field injection ever. So
if you upgrade IntelliJ IDE and you use field injection, you'll get that background by default now.
Yeah, that picture automatically pops up in your editor. Kudos to Oliver for making us aware of this really bad way of doing auto-wiring. And
so there's a quick fix, right?
Yeah, of course there's a quick fix. So again, hitting Alt-Enter, show intention actions. And I can convert this now to the recommended way, which is to use constructor injection. That's it. No manual typing, one quick fix, you're done. Okay?
What?
So the question is, do you still get a quick fix if there is already a constructor? I'm pretty sure it does that. Yeah. So it creates a new constructor just with the
it will append the existing constructor with the field.
So it also put the qualifier annotation there, so we are good to go, right? Actually, I want to see what happens when I change the profile now. So I can invoke that action also via go to action, which is your one-stop shortcut. Find action, just start typing the action name, and it will show you all matching actions. And one of them is change active Spring profiles. We get the same menu I invoked from the top navigation bar before. And I'm going to switch to the custom profile now to see what happens here. Oops. So the long bean 1 ID is not available in the custom profile. So we need to fix that. And again, I press Control Space to invoke completion, and now it shows me the beans which are available in the other profile, which I just selected, right? So that's all we have to say about auto-wiring and profiles, but I think it's a real nice feature to avoid setup errors and be sure that your application actually starts up. Okay.
I'm happy that we only have 25 minutes left because we'll be able to skip the XML section.
Yes. So XML fans, I'm sorry, we are going to skip that session, that part of the session.
Unless you disagree, right? Should we skip the XML support or?
I think we should.
Yeah, thumbs up, so we'll skip that. Someone will not happy, I know, but.
Okay. Next topic, Spring caching. What is Spring caching?
So you've seen that at the keynote, right? So you annotate your method with the cache annotation, and we will add a cache aspect to it. Whenever you invoke the method, sorry, we'll check if there is an entry in a cache, so you need to specify a name or multiple names. And if there is none, we will invoke your method as usual and update the cache accordingly. If there is, we won't even invoke your method, and we will return the information directly. So what Yann is showing now is the same thing with field injection. You can see that the cache annotation is on the interface, and there is a warning about that. The reason why there's a warning about that is because it's an implementation detail, right? So you may decide that one implementation uses caching and another one doesn't. You may disagree with that fact, so whenever there is those warnings, you can easily disable that in the IDE if you disagree with them. But I think also it's nice that the Spring team and the JetBrains team, they work together to actually push some of these best practices to you, so that you get a chance to, well, know about that stuff.
Okay, so I'm following the recommended way, disabling this annotation on the interface level, going to the actual implementation, and enabling it here on the implementation. And there's another warning. It wants something like a cache name. What is that?
So that's really a nice story about that stuff. In 3.2, when we introduced the caching infrastructure, the way you specify the cache was really constrained. So you had to provide a name on the cache annotation. That was the only way. So you would do cacheable, cache names, the name of the cache. Because it was the only way to specify it, the attribute was mandatory, right? So if you forget to specify it, the annotation has no default value, so you get a compilation error, and well, your code doesn't compile. So it's easy for you to understand something was wrong. In the meantime, the community said, okay, we would like more features. We would like to be able to externalize that stuff. We would be able to specify the cache names at the class level instead, which is the cache config that that's commented out on the top. So instead of repeating the name of the cache for every method, you would put it at class level, and it will be applied automatically for all the caches. That reduces copy-paste and improves maintainability. So it's really, really better. Problem now, the attribute is no longer mandatory, right? Because if you specify at the class level, you don't need to specify that at the method level anymore. So there is no compiler warning if you're in the sunny day cases with only one method. You just put add cacheable, you don't get any warning, and you try to start your app, and Spring Framework complains because it couldn't find the cache. So that's a very, very nice example, and there's plenty of them, where working with the IDE teams helps actually you to understand that stuff, understand the history. Well, you don't have to understand the history, that's the point. You get a warning telling you, hey, there is no cache names there, are you sure that's what you want? If well, that's what Yann did. If you uncommand the one at class level, the warning goes away.
Exactly. So there's another thing about this cacheable annotation, which I just enabled. There's a condition attribute here, and it looks funny because it has this green background here. So that actually hints me in my color scheme setup, that this string is actually a Spring.el or Spell expression. So the caching framework actually will evaluate this condition at runtime to determine if it's cacheable or not, right? And not only do we see this highlighted in a special way, but we also have full support for spell expressions. Because the IDE knows that this condition attribute must be a spell expression. So we inject the spell language support in this place. We have autocompletion, syntax highlighting, and I can even, for example, control-click to the corresponding resolved parameter. So that's something new in the latest version. We have now really context-dependent resolving for parameters on the method level, any kind of implicit variables which are available in that specific context. So, for example, the caching framework also adds some special variables here, like this caches collection, and many, many more. The same is also true for Spring security. So let me just show that very quickly. When I have the Spring security annotation here, pre-authorize, and again, green background, and I get autocompletion for all the Spring security methods which are available, because the IDE knows that they are bound automatically when you use Spring security and this annotation. And of course, we can again control-click here. We can show documentation on the method. Sorry, wrong shortcut. No. Yeah, that. So that's a very nice way to work with spell. And another thing we added for spell is we have no dedicated color settings for that language. So when you go to your colors and fonts scheme, you will actually see a Spring.el entry here, and you can customize all these attributes of the spell language to your likings.
So the spell support really is very different from one feature to the other. For instance, for the cache, you can inject the cache names, the method name, the target instance. You can inject parameters in a certain way. If you look at Spring Security, they have spell expression support as well, and the context is different. But because the IDE knows about them, you'll get dedicated autocompletion for the things you're trying to use. And that's yet another story, interesting story. If you go back to the cache example and you show the Java doc for the condition attribute, you'll see that there is plenty of content there. Okay, you can do this, you can do that, you can do this. And actually people complaining, I'm trying to use that condition thing and I don't know what I can do with it. Can you please make sure that I have an immediate access to that information? It turns out that, well, IntelliJ IDE has improved the support for that. So instead of reading all that doc, you just do the usual autocompletion command, and you'll see what you can use.
Yeah, so the root object we just saw in the Java doc is available here. Again, it knows the type, so we can navigate there. And yeah, I think that's very nice to have this kind of very context-sensitive support for Spring.el.
Let's show some stuff about Spring MVC now.
Okay. So Spring MVC was traditionally configured with XML. They also switched to annotation setup. So I'm just going quickly to the corresponding setup class, which is purely annotation based. We support that now finally. So we actually scan this code to understand what your setup is about. And we can see all of this also in the Spring Framework facet. So what we have here is an auto-detected Spring MVC context. So we just scanned your whole project. We found that Spring MVC config base class. We inspect the code you wrote there, and we set up all of this automatically for you. And the nice thing is it also detects all the beans which are related to Spring MVC, like view resolvers and stuff like that. When you use any of the calls you have here, for example, to configure view resolvers, and you want just JSP or FreeMarker support. Of course, you don't want JSP, but FreeMarker or some other proper technology. It will actually set up all the stuff just for you. So we have two view technologies here for demonstration purposes, and let's just quickly go to our controller. By the way, the Spring tool window also has a dedicated tab for Spring MVC, so when we go here, we can see the controller and the request mappings here.
Again, the presence of gutter icon on the left means, okay, Spring knows, IntelliJ IDE knows about that stuff and can give you assistance.
So the upper one, perform, actually is old school because we are using JSP here. And you get full auto-completion here to reference that file. I can control-click here, go to the JSP page. Go back to the controller. We added an attribute here to our model with the name and attribute for JSP. When we go to the JSP page, we can actually control-click and go back to the controller. So IntelliJ understands all of this, right? So as you type, as you start putting up your model, you will have full auto-completion in your views as well. And the same thing works with FreeMarker and Velocity now as well. So when we go to the FreeMarker view, we can also use this gutter icon here. Or my favorite shortcut is actually navigate related symbol.
That's your second favorite shortcut.
Yes, okay.
You already have one.
Okay, I'm really finding every couple of minutes. But related symbol, what does it? It inspects the current context. It could be a file, it could be some method, some class declaration. And it tries to figure out what is this and what kind of other files are related to this. So when we are in a request mapping method, it will know that we are there, and it will show me a list of matching stuff. One of them is the view that is actually used in this request mapping, and the other one is actually the Spring configuration that includes this controller class. So that's a very nice way, again, to see who is working with this current element. And here we have a FreeMarker view, and we have, of course, the same support for FreeMarker, velocity, time leaf. It's all there, right out of the box.
Don't you have a pop-up that actually shows that thing? A pop-up that actually shows how that value was set?
Yes, again, my third favorite shortcut, the quick definition, so I can actually see the code that puts that object in my module.
So you get basically the idea, right? You get a full link between your model and the controller. You can actually see in one way or the other how it works. It's intuitive because of the name of the view matches to a certain location. You don't have to find the file yourself. You just click on the name of the view and you'll end up in said view.
Yeah. So the last little thing I want to show with Spring MVC support is it's also included in go to symbol, which allows you to go to any kind of thing in the project. It could be a lot of things, actually. When I type a /, it will also include my request mappings here. So you can quickly go to any URI which is defined in your Spring MVC project. If you don't remember the name to controller class mapping, for example, that's a nice way to find the corresponding controller. Again, quick definition. Right.
There's a question there. Yeah. Can you speak louder, please?
So the question was, can you rename the variable and will it pick it up? Yes. No. I remember now, it's broken for FreeMarker. It works in JSP. I have to fix it for FreeMarker, right? So yeah, in theory, it works.
It will work for the next release.
Okay. Okay, so much about Spring MVC. We just touched the upper stuff. There's much more. Let's go to our favorite Spring project, Spring Boot, of course. So I guess most of you are aware of Spring Boot. We have a dedicated project wizard here, the Spring Initializer, which basically mimics what you can do on the Start Spring.io website.
And it's actually using start.spring.io, by the way. So whenever we push some changes to start.spring.io, new dependencies, new settings, the IDE actually contact the server to download the metadata. So it's updated automatically with that stuff.
Right. So we are going through this very quickly. I'm just picking the defaults. And here we can select the Spring Boot version. We have a long list of Spring starters which are available here. Because they're hard to find, we implemented some search and filtering. So it will not only search in the name, but also in the description and highlight them for you. We are just going to pick the web dependency. But one thing is funny, when I go back to an old version of Spring Boot, some of them are disabled. And the reason is that some starters are only available in range of Spring Boot versions, and if you use the tooltip here, you can actually see what the requirements are, okay? So let's use a more modern version.
So that's really your getting started experience with IntelliJ IDE and Spring Boot, right? You do create new project, you go through the wizard, and then you get a project that's ready to use. Remember what we've told about the Spring facet? If you use Spring Boot, don't worry about that, it's detected automatically for you.
Yeah, so what it did was to contact the Start Spring.io website, create a project for you on the server, return the zip, unpack it for you, set up the IntelliJ project, and create the Spring facet. Spring Boot context, auto configuration already triggered, we are ready to go.
And
right?
there is also a run configuration for the app that's been created automatically.
Yes.
So all you can do really is press run and the app is starting.
So I can just hit run application, it will build, and my Spring Boot application, which does nothing right now, will start. So Spring Boot is nice when you understand what auto configuration is about, right? That's the key, the magic behind it.
Yeah, I don't like the magic word, but yeah, you get the idea. So you probably know by now that Spring Boot has this auto configuration concept. So whenever you put something in your class path, like we've seen that Yann added the web starter that's going to bring Spring MVC, Tomcat embedded, and Jackson, and well, basically the basic stuff you need to build a web application. Spring Boot will detect that, and because you have no configuration, it will do something by default. There's a bunch of auto configuration, and it would be nice if you could have a way to actually know what's going on. So the JetBrains team is actually working on that, and we can see some of the stuff they've already done.
So again, this is our Spring config model graph. It shows nothing special, right? We have only our demo application main class annotated with the Spring Boot application class. So where's all the auto configs? They are provided by Spring Boot themselves. So there's a switch up here to enable library nodes. And when I fix the display, you can see all the auto configuration, which is actually triggered automatically by using Spring Boot. And you can inspect, is this what I actually want, right? So that's a nice way to see what auto configuration is kicking in, if everything is set up correctly. And again, we can navigate to any of those nodes and see any kind of problems here.
And think it this way. You've seen the relationship with auto wiring. So we've defined a bin of type long. That's a bad example, but okay. And then we had this gutter icon saying, okay, yes, this bin has been auto wired. And if you click on it, you can jump to the definition, right? With the auto configuration, let's say you rely on you're using JDBC template for whatever reason, or GMS template or whatnot, and you inject that in your component, but that's auto-configured by Spring Boot. So it's not there yet, because it's very, very hard to do, but you can think of maybe, we hope, in a future release, having that kind of feature for auto configuration. So you know that, for instance, if you get a warning, and it already works for quite a lot of things, basically, IntelliJ IDE doesn't know about that stuff. Maybe that's because something in your configuration on your, or on your class path isn't right. Maybe you forgot to add, I don't know, the right starter or something like that.
So talking about starters, there are many annotations following a certain name pattern. They all start with enable and then something. So I might actually want some WebSocket support. So I think there's an annotation for that, enable WebSocket, which is not on our class path right now, so we get an error. But IntelliJ is actually clever enough to figure out the corresponding starter for commonly used annotations or classes. So I can again hit Alt-Enter, my definite first high priority shortcut, and it will actually pick the WebSocket starter for me. And when we go to our POM XML, we will see that it was just added automatically for us, right?
So it's the same thing, right? Community feedback loop. If you have an annotation that you think might be useful to add, tell those guys. Yeah. I'm adding annotation foo, it should add starter bar and erase the class. It's very easy for them to add that, so do not hesitate to get in touch with them.
Right. So with all this auto configuration, how can you actually configure it?
Right.
Is there some way? Or?
Yeah. So you've seen probably at the keynote at some point what I've done again in the keynote. I can't remember. Oh yeah, weather. The location of the weather. So there was that weather locations hard coded. I moved that to a given class, and then all of a sudden some auto completion magic appeared. So what we want to do now is to show you how IntelliJ helps you building that infrastructure.
So what we see here in the application properties file, it works a similar way in YAML files, are all the configuration keys which are exposed by the starters we have available here. And yeah, maybe we want to add some own configurations. So
the way it works with Spring Boot is you create a POJO that defines your configuration structure, and you use the configuration properties annotation to give a prefix for your keys. So you basically have a POJO that's going to be bind from the environment. So in this case, I'm going to say, I want to bind that object to the Spring1 prefix. So every key starting with Spring1 dot something will be bound to that object. So in this case, I have Spring1 dot my property. If you specify that in config, it's going to call the setter right there. But we can see we have a red thing telling us that something might be wrong. Some annotation processor is missing, so maybe we can click on that link and see what happens. You can read the doc. It will explain you in more details what I'm going to say. So basically, for the content assistance to work, the IDE needs to know about your keys, and the way it knows about your keys is via a metadata file. So it's a file that's built, that's generated at runtime, looking at your code. So Yann is adding the necessary to the project right now. It's really a single dependency. You don't use that at runtime. It's only used at compilation time. That's why there's the optional flag on it. And if you compile and you go back to the configuration, you should see the things being available. Not yet, right? Oh, we forgot one thing, sorry.
We forgot something, right?
Yes, forgot to say that we want to enable that stuff.
No, there's nothing there yet. So we need actually to go back to our configuration class. And one thing we need to tell Spring Boot is that we actually want to enable support for this by listing the corresponding configuration classes we want to have here. I'm sorry, this was in the wrong file. So we are going to
don't do that.
Application.
Don't do that. You're doing that on yourself. That's bad.
So now it also shows up as Spring Bean because, again, the IDE understands that this is now used by Spring Boot implicitly. We are going to rebuild everything, and I think now it should work, right?
It should.
There it is. So now we can configure our property. We can control click here to go to the bean.
You also have this gutter icon. Yes. That's my favorite one.
So the gutter icon actually
next to the setter.
Yeah, it allows an inverse search, so I can actually see usages of that property in my configuration files, right? So you can immediately spot what properties are actually used in your config and which ones are exposed but not yet overridden or configured. So that's a nice way to do this.
You also have that in fine usage, and if you rename the property, it will automatically rename that in config, so you get the refactoring options working.
Mm. So right now we have a string property, which is a bit, I would say, stupid, because Spring Boot and IntelliJ cannot tell anything about possibly values which are allowed for this property or anything else. So what we need to do here is to add a file.
So this is really an advanced, it's really an advanced setup, right? So what we want to show you is if you want to provide even better assistance for your users, you have a key, it has a certain value, and you want to direct them to what kind of values can be used. The way you would do that is probably, in this particular case, is to use an enum type, and the IDE will automatically extract the values and provide auto-completion for the values. But let's say for some reason you can't, and well, it needs to be a string, whatever reason, and you still want to have auto-completion. Spring Boot has defined additional metadata that you can write to provide additional hints to that property. And you'll see also that you get auto-completion in that JSON file. So if you don't know what you have to write, you just ask the IDE to help you.
Right. So we will actually provide a couple of valid values here. I'm just giving them very stupid names. And
right. Oops. That's individual objects. Not the list.
Right, yeah. So I need to add this here.
Right. There's a comma missing.
And when we rerun the annotation processor, it will pick up those hints for us and expose them here. So, no?
There's an error in the JSON, I think.
I don't see.
I don't see it either. Wait. No, that's good.
Okay,
Rebuild.
let's try again. Yeah, sometimes it is a bit picky with picking up changes. So a full rebuild sometimes helps here. Yes, now we have it. So now the annotation processor processed all this additional metadata we just provided for our property, and we can, for example, define a list of valid values. We can define class name, which should be specified, logger names, stuff like this. So there's quite impressive number of stuff here.
There is really a rich model. So you'll see that when you use Spring Boot. So when you use Spring Boot with IntelliJ IDE, and you see that rich auto-completion for values, keep in mind it's very easy to add that to your own key, right? But what if I want to change that value only when I run the application in a certain state?
Right. We can do this actually in the run configuration. So there's a dedicated run configuration type for Spring Boot applications here. And we already see there's a section here for Spring Boot specific sections. Josh really hates me for hiding the banner, but I'm fine with that. And one possibility we added here is to override parameters, not in the configuration files, but also in the run configuration. So I can add additional parameters. Again, use code completion here. So maybe I want to redefine my SpringOne property stuff. And again, we get completion for the values here again. And what it will do, I specified value 2 in my default application properties, but when I run it from within the IDE, I want actually to override this parameter. And I can just do this in the run configuration without touching any of the config files, without using some sophisticated stuff, which I might use to
system
override
properties or
stuff.
like that.
Right,
Yeah.
so that's very nice and accessible to change stuff on the fly, just for testing out stuff. And yeah, that's it.
And we're running out of time, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So maybe 1 or 2 questions left. Yes, please.
So you have a lot of custom properties you can share with microservices. Can you jar up those configuration needs as well as the metadata configuration and share that?
Yeah. So the question was, if you have a lot of custom properties, can you share them via jars, for example, between different microservices?
So yeah, the scope is really the project really. So if you have the Projo in a certain project, you add the annotation processor, it will automatically include the metadata in the jar, and whenever the jar is on the class path, it will work. And you can have as many as you want. So the IDE will actually reconciliate all those files and provide you a unified repository for the keys.
Mm-hmm.
That's already what we have in Spring Boot. If you look at Spring Boot, certain modules actually ship with metadata. We don't have one gigantic file with everything. It's already isolated.
More questions?
Or you can come and we can have a chat.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.